With the announcement of the return of MBC, a Korean television channel network, to the world of esports, in as much as they will be taking over the main Overwatch competitions in South Korea, whereas before it was OnGameNet, and they were obviously running the OGN Apex tournament. I thought it was a good time to bring up this topic, which I've actually always felt this way as a fan of StarCraft Brood War, but I've almost never seen it expressed elsewhere in the community. And most people in the community tended to just think within the paradigm of the consensus that the OnGameNet StarLeague, the OSL, was the best Korean StarCraft Brood War individual league, 1v1 league. I realize technically every league's 1v1 because you just play the game 1v1, but the team leagues, obviously you play a series of 1v1s and you format the people. Now, personally, as someone who watched all of the individual tournaments like this, I went back through the years and watched the old ones from the early 2000s. The MSL was the better league, quite frankly. I realize it wasn't considered in terms of social status as the Premier League, the most important one. But first of all, there were only two for the majority of Brood War's lifespan. There was the OSL and there was the MSL. And obviously the MSL was the MBCgame StarCraft League. Now, there was also the GOM League, obviously, in like 2008, 2009, but that was only around briefly, and you saw there was problems with Kesper, and as a result, for example, in, I think it was the third season, one that Flash won, actually, there weren't all the Kesper teams, it wasn't SK Telecom, I believe. So, why was the MSL better, in my opinion? Right. Well, first of all, it had a superior format almost across the board. Hence, the champions, the greatest players in history, would not just win MSLs and do well in the MSL, they would dominate the MSL. There were many, many back-to-back champions and three-peats, actually, in the MSL. And for anyone wondering, there was never in all of history a single three-peat in the OSL. So let's talk about back-to-back three-peats. Okay, first of all, I'm ignoring Nada and his three-peat because his three-peat was technically in the KPGA Tour, which was the tournament that was the predecessor to the MSL. And actually, not only was it the predecessor, so it's not just that it was different in name, but actually the format was very different for the ones that he won. And it wasn't at all like the elements of the format I'm going to describe now, and hence I don't think it really applies. So I'm actually going to take that one out, even though technically you could include it. Now, I Love Uve had a three-peat. This is where he was actually his most dominant, was in the MSL. Savior went back-to-back in titles and won 3 titles within a 4-event span. Bisu went back-to-back in titles when he obviously had his rise in 2007, and he won 3 titles total within a span of 6 events. Flash went back-to-back in titles. Obviously, we're now talking about 2010, and had 3 titles in 4 events. Likewise, you look at finals appearances. Because it had a great format, by the way, great players would also get to the final more often than they would in the OSL. And we'll get into some of the reasons why in terms of format decisions. So finals appearances are much more strongly correlated with the greatest players for the MSL than they are for the OSL. And remember, these leagues used to run side by side. Not exactly, they would actually slightly offset them. So there was usually a week or so between the OSL final and then the MSL final. But they would run roughly 3 per year. Each of them, 3 MSLs, 3 OSLs. And it's not that, you know, there's so many tournaments that people only cared about the MSL, the OSL rather, and they weren't really trying the MSL. If you're a great player, it was so hard to win either of them that you just tried your best in both and saw which you went to the furthest in, and then that's it. So you look at finals appearances, 5 times, again, excluding the NADA KPGA Tour, 5 times in the history of the MSL, someone appeared in 3 straight finals. Over in the OSL, only twice did someone appear in 3 straight finals. Because in the OSL, it's actually not even that difficult. I can go ahead and tell you who they were. They were Boxer and they were... oh, wait a second. That must be wrong, actually. There must be 3 times then. Okay, 3 times for the OSL. I've just remembered off the top of my head there. Because in the OSL, it must obviously be Boxer early on because he had the chance for the 3-peat and didn't make it. And then we've obviously got Flash, who had his... No, that must be it then. Yes, because Flash didn't make the 3 finals. No, it was only actually Boxer and Fantasy, believe it or not, because obviously Fantasy at the very end made the 3 finals and then lost the last 2 to Jangbi. Now, in the OSL, I told you all those people who went back-to-back. There were actually only 3 players ever went back-to-back in terms of winning titles in the OSL. There was obviously Boxer in the early days. Then you move forwards in time, you get Jaedong, and at the very end you get Jangbi. Although admittedly, it's the very end of the game. The game's somewhat dying out. Players have moved on to StarCraft 2 from some of the teams. That one's a little bit less credible to me, but whatever. I mean, if we have to count the early days, we have to count the latter days, right? One of the reasons that this format was superior and was very, very good, admittedly, this doesn't necessarily play into the element of competitive integrity in making it superior. I actually think you can make an argument this somewhat destroys some elements of competitive integrity. But one of the things that I think made the MSL a better tournament to watch was the group selection ceremony. Because in the OSL, you just randomly drew the groups. And yeah, they would try to copy MSL and have these ceremonies where people commented on where they'd been drawn and gave thoughts, oh, here's what I'm playing. But in the MSL, here's the key thing you need to understand, because it's a brilliant format, is you used to literally, based on your placing in the last MSL, used to get seeding. And therefore, what would happen was, starting at the bottom of the seed, so the last place seed, they would pick the group that they go in. So for the first ones, they're just saying, I want to go in Group B. Oh, I want to go in Group C. And obviously, as the groups start to fill up, that's like really important because now you get to pick where you go. But here's the cool part. Once you get to the top seeds, they get more than just to say what group they're in. They get to do a move. Like they could put themselves in it. They could, I think once you get to the top, you had like 3 moves. So you could like move another player from a group that he'd placed himself in. You could put someone else in his group, and then you could put yourself in a group. So what that meant was, not only did the top players get to sort of play God with the format, so sometimes you had really cool ones where, for example, famously, I think it was Hydra, right, won the MSL and then placed like Jaedong, Bisu, and I think it was Flash. I think it was Jaedong, Bisu, and Flash all in one group of death because he just wanted to fuck with them. And then you also had other scenarios where, for example, Bisu had his little rivalry with Savior, and Savior had made a comment when Bisu had won like 1 title, like, well, when you've won 3, then come and decide to put yourself next to me. He meant in terms of like status. So then actually when Bisu did win his 3 titles, he put Savior next to him in an all Zerg group because he loved PvZ. I mean, funnily enough, he didn't get out of that group from what I remember, but I think it was the one that he lost to Magma, if I'm thinking of the right one. So the point is, it had a cool element where not only could the best players fuck around with the groups, but also then it made the group selection ceremony really fun because they weren't just commenting on where they'd been placed. Actually, what they would also do is they would appeal to the people who had the power to move multiple people up in the chain. So, for example, a teammate of Flash's might say like, oh, you're so good, Flash. Like, can you just take care of this player and move him out of my group? And can you put him in the group that you're in? Or, oh, this group's too hard, young. Can I go in another group? And sometimes they would like grant these requests. Sometimes they wouldn't. So I actually gave a lot of, what was a ceremony. It had a lot of pomp. It had a lot of fun. Had a lot of like banter involved in it. There's some great trash talk over the years. As I mentioned, that Bisu Savior trash talk. It was actually really cool. Now, admittedly, didn't play into the competitive integrity and the other elements I'm talking about. But in terms of overall why I think the MSL was better, this is another reason. So now let's get to some of the actual format decisions that made it better, and hence I think gave the outcome that it had better results and the great players won more often and were in finals more often. So first and foremost, they had GSL style groups. Now, admittedly, it's quite silly to call them GSL style groups because the GSL didn't exist and MSL was doing it before then. So really, are they GSL groups, or did the GSL use the MSL group system? You know, obviously the system existed outside of esports anyway, but the point here is I'm calling it GSL style groups because everyone who knows modern StarCraft, and in fact who even knows Counter-Strike now, knows what a GSL group is and understands the concept. So it's basically a small double elim bracket inside a 4-person group where top 2 come out, but you know, one person's going to win 2-0, one person's going to lose 2-0. The other 2 are going to be in a scenario where they play a decider match after losing a game each. So this, I actually think, is a much better format than best of ones in the OSL, which was just a round robin, because round robin has all those problems. You end up with tiebreakers. You end up with scenarios where someone's already lost, but you need them to try in their last game so that another person doesn't go through. You get all these problems that are very, very flawed about round robin. And GSL is a much superior format because all the games matter in a GSL style format. It doesn't matter. If you've already gone out, you're out. If you're already through, you're through. You can't then impact the results of the other people playing in the group. So I have found generally that leads to the better teams getting out more consistently because you don't get those little areas, those little grey areas, those weird vagaries where, as I say, someone's already out but they have to play and you hope they try. Someone's already through and you hope they try. You hope they don't just fuck around and give an easy win. Then, after the GSL style groups, you go to the round of 16 in the MSL. And the round of 16 in the MSL is best of 3 series play. Now, that's significant because in the OSL, when you went up through the group stages, you got to a 16-team group stage, and 16 player rather, and then that led to 8 players getting out and going to the round of 8. So you had group stages before the round of 8 in the OSL. Therefore, Group stages, you're playing a bunch of best of ones against people. It's less likely that the good top player is going to make it out. In the OSL, the round of 16 is a best of 3. So actually, it's even more likely that when good players get to that stage, they will continue to move on in the tournament. Hence, you get more good players, and especially the greatest players, the true champions, making it to the round of 8. Because even if they're like the best player in the world, but they have an off day, they could still maybe get through series play, whereas you lose one game otherwise to a weird cheese. Now you're in dire straits, as we saw, especially in the latter days of the OSL. Like, think of those ones where Jaedong and Flash weren't even making the playoffs when they were the best players in the world, especially Flash. So you go beyond that, because as I said, OSL only took you to the round of 8. But even then, the OSL I actually think was inferior, because the MSL, once you got to the round of 8, used reseeding. So they had the Kesper ranking, which luckily, because all the top Brood Wars played in Korea and it wasn't a global thing, there was never any problems with the ranking. And the ranking is based not only on individual leagues, but it's based on team leagues. It's based on all your games across the board of Kesper play, basically. And so as a result, it's pretty accurate, actually, when you look at who the top players are and who's actually performing elsewhere and getting wins. It's very good. Well, what they would do was, no matter the results of the tournament so far, once you make it to the top 8, they effectively say, congrats anyone who made it to the top 8. If you're a terrible player, you made it through, but you know what? Fair play. If you're a great player, you made it through, great. But you know what? We're not going to take the results of group stages in that aspect, because as I've always said personally, initial phases like group stages are just supposed to be about survival. It's not about showing who the better player is and ranking them to then later decide a bracket, because it can't. It's a different format to playing in best of X series play in a bracket. So as a result, MSL was one of the only tournaments I've ever seen which actually took the approach I like, which was they reseeded. As in, once you made it to the round of 8, if you're the number 1 seed and the number 2 seed is there, he's on the other side of the bracket and cannot play you until the final. If you are the number 1 seed and it turns out that you got upset and now you would, in the OSL, you might have to play the number 2 seed in the first round of the playoffs in the quarterfinals. That can't happen in the MSL. It gets reseeded. Now, as a result, you get more good players moving on in the MSL, and also you get the better matchups later in the bracket, in semi-finals, in the final. Meanwhile, in the OSL, wasn't like that. It was 1 plays 2. A number 1 seed player plays a number 2 seed player, and then randomly drawn. So as a result, I'll give you a great example of the flaws here of the OSL system. In late 2009, in the EVER OSL, you had Jaedong and Flash, the number 1 and number 2 players in the world, play each other in the quarterfinals of the EVER OSL. Meanwhile, over in the same tournament, but the MSL version that was running simultaneously, the NATE MSL, they were the number 1 and number 2 players in the world. Therefore, in the bracket, they were reseeded, and they met in the final in a best of 5. Well, guess what? Everyone wants to see the number 1 and number 2 player play in the final if they can. So the MSL got the better final. OSL ended up with Flash beat Jaedong in the quarterfinals, went to the final, played a guy called Movie, who never would have been in a position seeding-wise to have gotten to the final, but did, and easily crushed him in the final, and it was actually quite a shit final. So it actually provided worse games as well as not getting the better players through, although I'd say those two factors are connected, actually, if you think about it. Also, another format consideration, the MSL used best of 5 series play from the round of 8 where they'd reseeded onwards. So in the quarterfinals, you play a best of 5. In the semifinals, you play a best of 5. In the final, you play a best of 5. Therefore, it's harder to get to the final if you're not a good player. If you're a really great player, you've got a better chance of making the final. And with the reseeding, you're playing better opponents as you go through. It adds a level of prestige to deep finishes in the MSL. And then you get the amazing quarterfinals, good semifinals, good final, hopefully. In the OSL, best of 5 only began in the semi-finals onwards. So you had tons of round of 8 matchups that were amazing looking matchups on paper, especially because they didn't use the reseeding, so they might get what's their equivalent of a final, like the Jaedong versus Flash example I gave from the 2009 EVER OSL. That might happen in the quarterfinals, and you're like, oh fuck, it's in the quarterfinals, so it's just a best of 3. So that Jaedong versus Flash match was just a best of 3. Meanwhile, in the MSL, if they'd have met in the quarterfinals, which they couldn't have, it would have been a best of 5. So you have some amazing matches that happened in quarterfinals over in the MSL. Then you've got to consider that most of the prestige around the OSL wasn't really due to being harder to win or having superior finals or the games were better or more champions and therefore being the true way to crown champions. In fact, there was a saying, I believe, at one point in time in Korea that like the OSL was about like, you know, prestige and winning the biggest tournament, but the MSL was where the champions dominate and where they like do their work and consistently win. So One of the reasons why the OSL was more prestigious, well, first of all, it was the original. There was OSLs before there were MSLs. There was OSLs when there were KPGA tours, and that was just a secondary tournament off from the rest of the circuit, and then became a big tournament with the MSL and MBCgame taking over. That's how you're supposed to pronounce it, by the way. And then you've got to consider, part of the reason the OSL got really big, in my opinion, as a historian, is that they were there at the scene of the crime when Boxer became huge. And obviously Boxer becoming huge with his whole storyline, did a whole video about this, where he was like not only the best player, but a very creative player, and then he was a very clean-cut, wholesome image player. Therefore, he represented the heroic archetype to people, and everyone rallied behind him, and he became the best player. Therefore, with his rise in 2001, almost winning what would have been the Golden Mouse, there wasn't a Golden Mouse at that point in time, with the 3 straight OSL finals, which he sadly lost the third of them. In that scenario, yes, I can understand why the history of the game feels like it's attached to the OSL. But you look at the greatest champions ever, you look at the greatest games ever, I'd say a lot more of them happened in the MSL, and thanks, especially in the latter days, because a lot of these format things were like the last half of Brood War, which is still like 6 or 7 years. When the MSL was clearly superior for my money in terms of competitive integrity, in terms of the actual matches. Yes, there were some elements that were a little bit more funky, but I actually think a lot of the elements made the MSL the better league.
Hey, this is Huck. If you want to watch this top 3 asshole keep doing esports content, subscribe to Thorin's YouTube channel.